They thought she was just a frail old woman, easy to discard like the dry leaves of autumn. Enid Braddock watched her life be locked away while the man who stole it laughed in her face. He made one fatal mistake. He left her near the old orchard. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Enid's mother had been keeping a secret in that orchard for 60 years. A secret she had sewn into the lining of an old gardening apron, waiting for the one person it was meant for. What Enid found under those roots will make you believe that a mother's love does not end at the grave. And what happened the following morning when the machines arrived to tear down the trees left an entire county without words. If you believe that the truth always finds its way home, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories that prove it. Now let's begin. The farm on Kettle Creek Road had been in the family for 3 generations, which meant it had been in the family longer than the county road that ran past it, longer than the feed store in town that everyone used as a landmark, longer than most of the trees except the apple orchard on the south side of the property. Enid Braddock had lived on this farm for all of her 74 years, which was not something many people could say about anywhere anymore. She had been born in the back bedroom, the one with the window that caught the morning light, and had grown up in these rooms and married Prentice Braddock at 23 and raised 2 daughters here, and buried Prentice 3 years ago in the churchyard 4 miles down the road, and had continued because the farm required continuing, and because she was the kind of woman who continued. Prentice had been a good man, not a perfect man because perfect men do not exist outside of eulogies, but a good one. He had come to the farm as a young husband and had understood from the beginning that this land belonged to the Thornberry women and that his role was to work alongside them rather than ahead of them. He had understood this without resentment, which was rare in a man of his generation, and he had built his life within that understanding with a kind of quiet dignity that Enid missed every day, not in the dramatic way of fresh grief, but in the steady way of a woman who reaches for something on the nightstand and finds only air where a familiar shape used to be. The farm was hers. This had never been a question. Prentice had understood, it had always understood it the way people understand the ground rules of a life they have entered into willingly. The farm was Enid's, had been Enid's of mother's before her would be Enid's daughters when the time came. The deed was in the county records. The history was in the land itself, in the way the fields had been managed and the orchard tended, and the house maintained through the years by the women who had lived here. The orchard had been planted by Enid's mother Corinne in the summer. Enid turned 14, and it had outlasted everything. The hard winters of the 60s, the drought of 1988, the ice storm of 89, the slow attrition of time that takes things from you, whether you are paying attention or not. The orchard had outlasted them all, and it had outlasted Corinne herself. Corinne had called them iron trees. This was not a variety name, but a personal one, her way of acknowledging the particular hardiness of the apple stock. She had chosen a heritage variety she had sourced from an elderly orchardist in the next county who had been growing them since before the war. Trees that produced a small, dense, intensely flavored apple that was not beautiful by commercial standards, but that kept through the winter and made a cider unlike anything Enid had tasted from any other source. The 2 of them had set each tree into the ground together that summer, with the focused care of someone who understands that they are making a decision for decades rather than seasons. Enid had tended that orchard for 60 years in her mother's name, and the orchard had not been well for some years now. The leaves came sparse in spring. The fruit when it came was small, even by its own modest standards. Several trees had not leafed out at all this past season. It was a grief Enid carried quietly, the knowledge that the trees Corinne had planted with such intention were declining in ways she had not been able to prevent. But Enid was not the kind of woman who abandoned things because they were difficult. She had consulted, she had tried remedies, she had given the orchard the same attention she gave everything, and she had kept going. The last time Enid stopped by Larkin Hendren's feed store on Main Street, the conversation had turned to the orchard the way conversations between old friends turn to familiar concerns. Larkin 68 had been running that store for 30 years and had known the Thornberry family most of his life. He stood behind the counter loading bags of late-season fertilizer while Enid waited, and he asked about the trees the way a man asks about a sick relative carefully. Enid told him what she always told him. The orchard was struggling, but she was not giving up. Larkin set the last bag on the counter and looked at her over his reading glasses and said something she would remember later with a particular sharpness. "Your mama planted those trees to outlast every one of us, Enid. I believe they will." She thanked him and loaded the fertilizer into the bed of her truck and drove back to Kettle Creek Road with Larkin's words settling into the place where she kept things that mattered. She did not know yet that she would need them. There was also the matter of Sable. Sable was Enid's younger daughter, 44, living in Nashville, working in real estate, and carrying on a quiet campaign that had been building since Prentice died. The campaign was this: sell the farm, move to Nashville, get a supported living apartment, be practical. Sable had called 2 weeks before the Wednesday in September that changed everything, and the conversation had gone the way those conversations always went, which was nowhere useful. Sable talked about the market, about the value of the land, about what Enid could get if she listed now before prices shifted. Enid listened the way she listened to weather forecasts for places she had no intention of visiting. When Sable finished, Enid said what she always said calmly and without anger: "When I can't get up on my own anymore, we'll have that conversation." "You're stubborn, Mama," Sable said. Not as an insult exactly, more as a diagnosis. "I know," Enid said. And she did know. She had been stubborn her entire life, and it had served her well more often than it had not. And she saw no reason to reconsider the trait at 74. Louetta, the older daughter, lived in Oregon and called every Sunday and supported her mother without qualification, which was appreciated, but did not change the fact that Oregon was 2,000 miles away, and support from 2,000 miles has a particular quality of warmth without weight. Louetta agreed with Enid. Louetta also could not be here. Irving Bancroft arrived on a Wednesday morning in September, which was a morning Enid had planned to spend picking the last of the late-season tomatoes. The garden was at its end of summer best. The tomatoes heavy, the late beans still producing, the herbs gone to seed in the way that meant she would have seeds for next year. She was in the middle of this when she heard the truck come down the drive. She looked up. It was a truck she did not recognize. Large knew, the kind of truck that cost more than the equipment in her barn, driven by a man she had not seen in perhaps 15 years and would not have recognized on the street without prompting. Irving was the son of a cousin of Prentice's, the family connection attenuated enough that Enid had never used the word relative without some internal qualification. He had been at Prentice's funeral, briefly standing at the edge of the gathering with the particular expression of someone performing presence. She had thanked him for coming. She had not thought about him again. He got out of the truck with a folder under his arm and a man she did not know who carried a briefcase and had the expression of someone employed to appear authoritative and who was managing this with practiced adequacy. The man's name was Grady Pennington, and Enid noticed two things about him immediately. His shoes were too polished for a county road, and his eyes moved away from hers whenever she looked directly at him. She filed both observations without comment. They stood in her driveway with the ease of people who have done this before. Enid Irving said. He said her name with the easy familiarity of someone who has been practicing a conversation and has decided that first names establish a tone that serves his purpose. Irving, she said. She set down the basket she had been carrying. He explained the situation, but he did not just explain it. He told a story. The story was about Prentice, and it was a story designed to hurt in a specific way. Irving said that Prentice had been worried in his final months, worried about Enid's ability to manage the farm alone, worried about the failing orchard, worried that his wife was, as Irving put it, holding on to something that had already let go. He said Prentice had confided these worries to Irving and at a family gathering that Enid did not remember attending. He said Prentice had signed the documents because he wanted to ensure the land would be, as Irving said, with the careful emphasis of a rehearsed phrase used properly. Enid listened. She listened to Irving put words in the mouth of her dead husband, attribute thoughts to a man who could not contradict them, construct a version of Prentice that served Irving's purpose and dishonored everything Prentice had been. This was worse than the forged documents. The documents were paper. This was the theft of memory. The explanation involved Prentice's estate, a will that had apparently been prepared some years before his death, and that superseded the arrangements Enid had understood to be in place, provisions that had been made without her knowledge, and the summary conclusion that the property on Kettle Creek Road was to be transferred to Irving Bancroft as the named beneficiary. She asked to see the document. She read it carefully, standing in her own yard with Irving and Grady watching the way she read everything methodically from the beginning, without skipping. She had learned this from her mother, who had said more than once that the difference between the people who got taken advantage of and the people who did not was whether they read what they were signing. She read it twice. The language was formal and dense in the way of legal documents designed to obscure rather than clarify. But she had managed farm accounts and contracts and the paperwork of a working farm for 50 years, and she understood what she was reading. She understood it very clearly. It was not Prentice's signature. She had looked at Prentice's signature on documents for 49 years, and she knew it the way she knew his face. What was on this page was a careful approximation, the work of someone who had studied the original and reproduced it with attention, but not quite with the truth. She said this calmly, directly, without raising her voice. But she did not say everything she saw. She also noticed that Grady Pennington's eyes slid away from hers when she asked about the notarization date. She noticed that Irving had prepared answers for every objection, the kind of preparation that comes from rehearsal rather than truth. She understood that this was not a conversation. It was a performance, and she was meant to be the audience that surrendered. She chose instead to be the audience that watched. Irving mentioned the court order. He said that Judge Orville Langford had signed a temporary order authorizing the transfer of property use while the inheritance process was resolved. Grady produced the document. Enid looked at it. The court seal was real. The judge's signature was real. This was not a forgery like the will. This was a real court order signed by a real judge based on forged documents. And this meant that even if law enforcement arrived, they would be bound by the order. Enid understood the architecture of what was happening. Irving had not just forged a will, he had built a structure around the forgery, a structure that included a court order from a sitting judge, a licensed attorney, and the appearance of legitimacy that would require more than her word to dismantle. This was not an impulsive crime. This was a system engineered piece by piece, and the precision of it told her something important about the man standing in her driveway. He had done this before. You do not build something this elaborate the first time. She filed this understanding alongside everything else she had observed, and she waited. Not passively, She waited the way a woman waits who has managed a working farm for 50 years and who knows that the difference between a wasted day and a productive one is often nothing more than knowing when to act and when to hold still. By noon, there were two additional men from Irving's truck who had begun moving through the house with the systematic efficiency of people performing an inventory. They opened drawers and closets and cabinets, touching the things Enid had accumulated over a lifetime, with the indifferent hands of people who see objects rather than memories. She watched through the window as one of them picked up the photograph of Prentice from the mantelpiece, looked at it briefly, and set it face down. She did not react. She recorded. By 2 o'clock, the locks had been changed on the front door while Enid stood in the yard. The locksmith, a young man from the next town who had probably been told this was a routine job, avoided her eyes as he worked. He finished quickly and left without speaking to her, and Enid understood that he had been paid enough to not ask questions, but not enough to feel comfortable about it. And then the sedan pulled in. Enid recognized the car before it stopped. Her heart moved faster, not from fear, but from something close to hope. Her daughter was here. Sable stepped out. She did not look at Enid first. She looked at Irving. She nodded to him, the familiar nod of two people who have spoken before this moment, who have an understanding that preceded this morning. Enid stood very still. She watched her daughter walk toward Irving, stand beside him, not beside her. Sable said, "Mama, I've been talking with Irving. I think you should hear him out." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of air before a storm that has not yet broken. Sable continued, her voice carrying the practiced reasonableness of someone who has prepared her argument. "Mama, this farm is too much for one person. I've said this how many times now? If Daddy signed this and the document says he did, then maybe he was thinking the same thing. Irving says he'll pay you a fair amount. You could buy a condo near me in Nashville." Enid looked at her daughter. She was not angry, or rather the anger was somewhere very deep below what she was feeling in the immediate moment, which she could only call pain. The pain of a mother watching her daughter stand beside the man who was taking her mother's home. She asked, her voice so level that Sable had to look closely, "How much did Irving offer you?" Sable blinked. Then her face flushed. Enid said, "I'm asking sincerely. When a man running a land fraud needs the victim's daughter on his side, he has to pay for it. How much?" Sable did not answer, but she did not deny. The silence was answer enough. And in that silence, Enid understood something she had not understood before about the distance between her and her younger daughter. It was not just Nashville. It was not just the years of phone calls that ended in disagreement. It was something deeper, a fundamental difference in how they measured value. Sable had learned to see the world in terms of transactions, numbers, what things were worth on paper. Enid had learned from Corinne to see the world in terms of what things were worth in the ground, in the roots, in the slow, patient accumulation of time and care. The farm was the same object to both of them, but they were looking at different things when they looked at it. By 3 o'clock, Irving was standing on the porch of the house that had been in her family for 3 generations, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who believes he has won. Sable stood beside him, her face arranged into something she probably meant to look like concern, but that Enid recognized as the expression of someone who has made a choice and is not yet sure it was the right one. "You're welcome to take what you can carry," Irving said. "I'd suggest making it quick. I have people coming tomorrow to start clearing the south field." The south field, the orchard. Enid looked at him. She thought about what she could say and what would be useful to say and what the difference was between those two things. She had spent 74 years understanding that difference, and she had learned that the most powerful response to something like this was not the one that expressed the full measure of her feeling, but the one that moved the situation in the direction she intended. "The apron," she said. "My mother's apron. It's on the hook in the kitchen." Irving went inside and came back with it. He held it out without ceremony, the way you hand someone something you consider worthless. She took it. She folded it over her arm. Then she turned and walked south toward the orchard because there was nowhere else to go, and because the orchard had always been where she went when she needed to think. Behind her, she heard Irving say something to Grady. She heard him laugh. She heard Sable say, "She'll come around." She kept walking. The apple orchard covered roughly 3 acres on the south side of the farm, running from the fence line at the road to the creek at the back of the property. Enid walked through the orchard gate and stopped. The trees stood around her in the September afternoon, their branches mostly bare, the light coming through them at the angle of early autumn that made even bare branches look like something worth noticing. She had walked through this orchard 10,000 times. She knew every tree, could have named the order in which they had been planted, could have told you which ones had produced the best fruit in which years, and which had always been slower than the others, and which had survived the ice storm of '89 that had taken 3 of the oldest. The orchard had a particular smell in September that was different from its smell in any other month. In April, it smelled like blossom, sweet and almost painfully hopeful. In August, it smelled like ripening fruit, warm and dense. In September, it smelled like earth and bark and the slow chemistry of leaves beginning to let go, a smell that was not decay exactly, but transition, the smell of a living system shifting from one state to another. Enid breathed it in and felt it settle into her body the way familiar smells do, not as information but as identity. This smell was who she was. This place was who she was. And the man on the porch of her house wanted to cut it down and sell the lumber and grade the land flat and build something on it that had nothing to do with any of this. She walked to the center. The central tree was the first one Corinne had planted, the one she had put in the ground before any of the others, establishing the heart of the arrangement from which everything else radiated. It was the largest tree, or had been. It was now reduced, its crown thinned, several major branches gone. But the trunk was still substantial, the root system still anchoring deeply into the Tennessee clay. And when Enid put her hand on the bark, it held the warmth of the September sun stored and released slowly the way old wood does. She sat down at the base of the tree with her back against the trunk, the way she had sat as a child while Corinne read to her. Her mother had read to her here through summers and autumns, the two of them against this trunk with the orchard around them and the farm beyond it, and the particular quality of Tennessee afternoon light that made everything feel both immediate and eternal. She held the apron in her lap. It was older than she remembered it looking. The fabric had the translucency of cloth that has been washed hundreds of times over decades, the faded blue of a color that had once been strong. There were stains that no amount of washing had fully removed, the accumulated record of a life spent in a garden and a kitchen. She could smell, or thought she could smell, the faint ghost of lavender that had been Corinne's particular scent, the lavender water she had made herself every summer from the plants in the kitchen garden. She pressed the apron to her face and breathed in. The lavender was there, faint, nearly gone, but present. It was enough. The ghost of her mother's particular scent, held in the worn fibers of a garment that had been on her body through thousands of ordinary days. She allowed herself to grieve. Not strategically, not as a managed process, but the real thing. The compound grief of a woman who had lost her husband and now her home, whose daughter had stood beside the man who took it, who was sitting in the orchard her dead mother had planted, holding her dead mother's apron, with no clear path forward. She allowed it because she had learned in 74 years that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a passage to be moved through, and that moving through it quickly was not the same as moving through it well. After a while, the grief settled into the particular stillness that comes after it, the clarity that arrives when the acute wave has passed. She looked down at the apron. She was running her hands along the hem, an automatic gesture, the kind of physical habit that hands develop without the mind directing them when she felt it. Something hard, small, sewn into the fabric of the hem, in the fold of the stitching, invisible unless you were looking for it, or unless your hands found it, the way hands find things they were meant to find. She held the hem up to the afternoon light, a small shape enclosed in the fabric. She worked the stitching carefully with her fingernails, the way her mother had taught her to work delicate things slowly without force, finding the give rather than creating it. The hem opened, and a small bronze key fell into her palm. She sat with the key in her hand for a long moment. It was old, not antique old in the way of things preserved carefully, but old in the way of things that have been used and kept the bronze worn smooth at the edges, the profile simple and specific. It fit a lock she did not immediately recognize, but it had the quality of something made to fit a specific lock and no other. She turned it over. On the flat of the key's head, barely visible, someone had scratched a small symbol, a tree she thought simple and unmistakable, two lines for trunk and a curve for crown. She looked at the apron again. She had unstitched the hem to release the key, and in doing so she had opened a fold she had not noticed before. A small pocket in the lining sewn shut with the careful stitching of someone who intended it to stay closed for a long time. She worked this open too. Inside was a piece of paper folded small and wrapped in a scrap of oilskin that had kept it dry through whatever years it had been there. The paper was yellowed and fragile at the folds, but it held when she opened it carefully. The handwriting was Corinne's. She would have known it anywhere, the particular forward slant the letters formed, with the deliberate care of a woman who had taught herself to write well and had never stopped taking the act seriously. She had read her mother's handwriting on recipes and letters and notes left on the kitchen table her entire life. She read it now in the September orchard with the light changing around her. My sweet Enid, by the time you find this, I will be gone. I have sewn this key into the hem of this apron because I know you will keep the apron the way you keep everything that matters, carefully and close. And I know that someday you will need what the key opens, though I pray it is not from desperate circumstances. Under our tree, the first one I planted the heart of the orchard, there is a box. It has been there since 1955. You must dig at the east side of the roots, where the largest root meets the trunk above ground, at the place where the bark has always grown in a curve that looks like a closed eye. Inside the box is what I saved. Not money, my darling. I never had money to save. What I saved was something I believed mattered more, and something I believed would protect you if you ever needed protecting. The land is yours. It has always been yours. I made certain of it. The roots that feed us are the same roots that protect us. I have always believed this. I have built my whole life on it, and I built your inheritance on it too. Find the box. Read every single letter with care. Trust what you find. All of my love across whatever distance separates us. Your mother, Corinne. Enid read the letter twice, then a third time, then she folded it back into the oilskin and put it in the pocket of her shirt close to her body. She looked at the central tree, the first one planted the heart of the orchard. She looked at its base, at the roots that rose above the ground before disappearing into the soil. She found the east side. She found the largest root where it met the trunk, where the bark grew in the curve her mother had described. She saw it immediately, had probably seen it 10,000 times without registering it as a landmark, the way you see things so often they become invisible. She did not have a shovel. She had her hands. The September clay was hard with dryness, and Enid Braddock was 74 years old, and her daughter had just betrayed her, and her home had just been stolen, and her dead husband's memory had just been used against her by a man who had never known him. She knelt at the base of the tree her mother had planted 60 years ago, and she began to dig. The Tennessee clay fought her. It fought her the way the earth fights anyone who tries to take something from it without the proper tools, which is to say, it fought her with patience and indifference, and the absolute certainty that it had been here longer than she had and would be here after she was gone. Enid dug with her hands, and with a flat rock she found nearby, loosening the soil at the east side of the root where her mother had directed her, working carefully so as not to damage the root system more than necessary. Her knuckles bled. The soil packed under her fingernails and turned the creases of her palms into dark lines that looked like a map of somewhere she had never been. She did not stop. She had spent 74 years on this farm, and she had done harder things than this, though at the moment she could not remember specifically what they were. She had been digging for perhaps 20 minutes when her fingers found something that was not soil and not root. She cleared the surface carefully. Metal, the top of a container, its surface rough with decades of soil contact but intact. She worked around it, finding the edges, understanding its dimensions. Larger than she had expected, rectangular, heavy when she tested it. It took another 20 minutes to free it sufficiently to lift. When she finally worked it clear of the soil and set it on the ground beside her, she sat back and looked at it in the failing September light. It was a military ammunition box, the kind used in the Second World War, heavy-gauge steel designed to be airtight and waterproof and durable under field conditions. Someone had wrapped it additionally in what had been a leather saddlebag, the leather now stiff with age but still largely intact. The combination had done exactly what Corinne intended it to do: keep what was inside safe through 60 years of Tennessee seasons. She worked the leather loose. The metal box beneath was sealed with a clasp, and the clasp's lock was the particular size and shape of the bronze key in her hand. She turned the key. The clasp released with a small metallic exhale, as if the box itself had been holding its breath. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had preserved them from moisture, were bundles of envelopes. Many bundles, each tied with a piece of kitchen string that had dried and stiffened over the decades. The envelopes were of various ages and sizes, addressed in different hands, some formal, some barely legible, some in the careful block letters of people for whom writing was effortful. They were addressed to Corinne Thornberry, which had been her mother's maiden name, at the farm address on Kettle Creek Road. She lifted the first bundle and opened one envelope carefully. The letter inside was dated October 1945. It was from a man named Vance W. Treadway, Sergeant, United States Army. He was writing from a veterans hospital in Georgia where he was recovering from wounds sustained in France. He wrote to thank a woman named Corinne Thornberry, who had written to him every month for 2 years while he was overseas, who had sent packages of food and small useful items, and who, had, he wrote, kept him connected to the idea of home when home felt impossibly far away. He wrote that he did not know how to repay her except with gratitude, which he offered in full. He was enclosing a small token, a silver dollar from the year of his birth, 1920, as a way of marking the occasion of his survival. She found the coin in the envelope, smooth and cool, between her fingers. She opened another, a letter from a woman named Maudie, dated 1962, thanking Corinne for helping her family through a winter when Maudie's husband had been sick and the farm was failing. For the meals left at the door, for the money tucked into the meal basket without comment or expectation of return. A coin enclosed a walking Liberty half-dollar. Maudie wrote that it had belonged to her grandmother and that she wanted Corinne to have it as a keepsake of the kindness between them. Bundle after bundle, letter after letter, soldiers, families, neighbors, strangers who had become known through kindness. A woman in Kentucky whose children Corinne had fed through a winter she had not mentioned to anyone. A soldier from Iowa who had received letters every month for 3 years because he wrote they sounded like his mother. An elderly man in the next county whose crops had failed and who had found one morning that someone had left feed and seed on his porch without a note. Enid had known her mother as a kind woman. She had not known the scale of it. She had not known that Corinne had been writing to soldiers overseas for years, had been feeding families through hard winters, had been quietly and consistently doing the work of care that does not appear in any record because it was never meant to. And each letter had brought a coin. Some silver dollars, some half-dollars, some foreign coins from soldiers stationed abroad, a few gold coins of various denominations. Hundreds of coins in total. Each one a thank you. Each one a record of a connection made and sustained across the years, of a life lived in service to others without ever asking for acknowledgement. She was still reading when she found pressed between two bundles near the middle of the box a letter that stopped her. It was not a thank you letter. It was dated 1958, written by a woman named Vernell from the next county, and it told a different kind of story. Vernell's husband had tried to take Corinne's land using the same method Enid had just experienced. Forged documents, legal pressure. A man who believed he could take what belonged to a woman because he believed women did not fight back. Corinne had helped Vernell keep her own land during the same period, and Vernell had written to thank her. One line stood out as if it had been written in ink, darker than the rest. "Sister Corinne, you taught me that false papers fear true papers most of all." Enid read that line 3 times. Her mother had faced this before. Not this exact situation, not Irving specifically, but this kind of predator, this kind of theft. And Corinne had not just survived it, she had learned from it. She had prepared. She found the envelope at the bottom of the box, not bundled with the others, separate, sealed with wax that had hardened over the decades, addressed in Corinne's handwriting to Enid specifically. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a property deed, the original deed to the farm on Kettle Creek Road, registered in the county records on the 14th of March, 1955, in the name of Corinne Thornberry, with a notation attached that established the property in a family trust of specific terms. The trust stated that the property was held in perpetual trust for the female lineage of the Thornberry family to pass from mother to daughter in direct line and could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered by any means other than the consent of the current female heir. The trust had been witnessed and notarized by a county judge named Doyle Kinsley and was, as far as Enid could determine in the fading September light, entirely valid. Her name was on it, not Prentice's name, not Irving's name, hers. Enid Jane Thornberry Braddock, daughter of Corinne Thornberry, sole heir of the Thornberry Family Trust. She sat for a long time with the documents in her hands while the light left the orchard. Above her, in the iron tree that Corinne had planted first, a single late apple, small and dense, and the color of old gold, turned slowly in the evening air. She did not sleep in the farmhouse that night. The farmhouse was locked, and she was not going to break a window to enter her own home. Not because she was incapable of it, but because that was not how she operated, and because the situation, however extreme, did not require it. She had what she needed. She had the documents and the key and the knowledge of what was in the box. She slept in the orchard, leaning against the trunk of the central tree, the apron around her shoulders for whatever warmth it offered, the ammunition box secured between the roots where it had rested for 60 years, the documents inside her shirt against her skin. She did not cry again. She had done her crying and she was done with it, not because the situation did not warrant more, but because crying was not what the situation required now. What the situation required was thinking. She thought about Corinne. Her mother had died 11 years ago at 89 in the back bedroom where Enid had been born. Died as she had lived, without drama and without complaint, having given her full attention to the world until she could no longer do so. Enid had been with her. She had held her mother's hand and felt the strength go out of it by degrees, the way heat leaves a stone after sunset, slowly and then all at once. She had not understood then the full measure of who her mother had been. She had known Corinne as a good woman, a strong woman, a woman who managed a farm and raised a daughter and kept her house and her garden and her orchard with the steady attention that some people give to prayer. She had not known about the soldiers. She had not known about the families fed through winters. She had not known about the coins kept under the tree, or the trust filed in the courthouse, or the keys sewn into the apron with stitches meant to hold for decades. She knew now, and the knowing changed the shape of her grief from something formless into something architectural, something with weight and structure, something she could lean against the way she was leaning against this tree. She thought about Opal Ashford, the county clerk, who had worked at the courthouse for 30 years and who had known Enid's family all her life. She thought about Sheriff Alton Caulfield, who had also grown up in this county and who took his responsibilities seriously. She thought about the coins and the man in Cookville who could appraise them. She thought about Larkin Hendren, who was close, who was a friend, who could help her in the morning. She organized these thoughts the way she had organized things her whole life. Items in sequence, each one dependent on the one before, each one moving her toward the outcome she intended. When the list was complete, she went through it once more and then set it aside. Sometime in the night, she heard a truck moving slowly on the county road. Headlights swept across the orchard, painting the bare branches white for a moment before darkness returned. The truck stopped, sat idling for several seconds, then pulled away. She did not know if it was Irving's people checking on things or someone else entirely, but it reminded her of what she already knew. The machines were coming in the morning. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to the moment when the trees Corinne planted would be cut down. Time was not on her side. She slept before dawn briefly and without dreams. She woke to birdsong and the gray that precedes first light in the Tennessee hills. She lay still for a moment, aware of the ground beneath her and the tree behind her and the orchard around her, and she felt with absolute clarity exactly where she was and what she intended to do. She got up. She brushed the soil from her clothes. She straightened the apron and put it on properly, tied at the back the way Corinne had always worn it, the ties looped twice and knotted at the front. She picked up the ammunition box. She walked out of the orchard toward the road. Larkin Hendren's house was a mile down the county road. Enid arrived at 6 in the morning, the ammunition box under her arm, dried blood on her knuckles, soil still dark under her fingernails. Larkin opened the door in his pajamas and slippers, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that Enid tracked with the attention she had been giving everything since yesterday morning. Surprise, concern, and then something she had not expected from a man she had known for 40 years. Fear. She told him what had happened briefly and precisely the way she would have described a problem with a piece of farm equipment. She told him about the forged will, the court order, the locks being changed. She told him about the box and the trust document. She did not tell him about Sable, because that was not relevant to what she needed from him. Larkin listened. He sat down at his kitchen table and rubbed his face with both hands. And when he looked up, the fear was still there, but it had been joined by something worse, which was shame. He said he knew Irving Bancroft, not well, but enough. And more importantly, he knew Grady Pennington. 3 years ago, Grady had sued a neighbor of Larkin's, a man named Tatum Pardo, over a property line dispute. Tatum could not afford a good lawyer. Grady dragged the case through 3 hearings until Tatum went bankrupt and had to sell his land to cover legal fees. Larkin had watched the whole thing happen. Enid, I care about you, but Grady Pennington bankrupted Tatum Pardo, and he can bankrupt me. I've got the store. I've got my wife's medical bills. I can't. His wife Dee Dee was in the next room. Enid could hear the television playing the low murmur of a morning program. Dee Dee had multiple sclerosis and had been in a wheelchair for 4 years, and Larkin's feed store was the only thing standing between her and a county facility. Enid knew this. She had brought casseroles to this house when Dee Dee's condition worsened. She had driven Dee Dee to appointments in Cookville when Larkin could not close the store. She understood the math of Larkin's fear, and the math was real. But understanding the math did not make the refusal hurt less. It only made it hurt in a more specific way, the way a wound hurts more when you can see exactly where the blade went in. Enid looked at Larkin, 40 years of friendship, the man who spoke about Corinne with reverence every time Enid stopped by the feed store, standing in front of her and saying no. She was not angry. She understood that fear was a real thing and that Tatum Pardo's story was a real reason. But she also understood something she had not fully grasped until this moment, which was the depth of her aloneness. Husband dead, daughter standing with the enemy, oldest friend afraid. Larkin gave her a cup of coffee and a piece of bread. He did not let her use his phone. I don't want my number showing up in any records, he said, and the shame in his voice was so thick that Enid could almost see it sitting on the kitchen table between them like a physical object. She drank the coffee. She thanked him. She picked up the ammunition box and walked out the door and down the road toward Opal Ashford's house, another mile further. The morning was cool and the road was empty, and the light was doing what early light does in Tennessee in September, which was to come at an angle that made the dew on the roadside grass look like scattered coins. Enid walked with the ammunition box under one arm and the apron tied at her waist, and she was aware that she must look strange, a 74-year-old woman walking a county road at dawn carrying a military box and wearing an apron that belonged to the previous century. She did not care. She had reached the point in the situation where the opinions of passing drivers were no longer relevant information. She thought about Sable as she walked. She thought about the years of phone calls and the growing distance and the particular frustration of loving someone who has decided that your life is a problem to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. She thought about whether she could have done something differently, whether she could have brought Sable closer to the land and the orchard and the history of the Thornberry women in a way that would have prevented her daughter from standing beside Irving Bancroft on the porch of her own mother's house. She did not know the answer. She suspected the answer was complicated and did not admit of simple formulations. She set the question aside for now because the question was not useful at this moment, and Enid had learned decades ago that the most important skill in a crisis is the ability to distinguish between questions that require immediate answers and questions that can wait. She reached Opal's house at 7:15. The walk had taken 40 minutes from Larkin's place, and she had used the time to adjust her plan. Larkin was not coming. Sable was not coming. Louetta was in Oregon. She had the documents, and she had herself, and she had Opal Ashford if Opal was willing. Opal was already up. She was always already up, a woman of habit in early hours, and she opened the door with the expression of someone who has seen something unexpected and is taking a moment to assess it fully before responding. "Enid," she said. "Opal, I need your help, and I need to use your phone." Opal Ashford was the county clerk. She had spent 30 years working with property records and legal documents, which meant she had a practiced eye for the difference between authentic documentation and its approximations. She read the trust document in the original deed while Enid drank coffee at her kitchen table, and she read them with the focused attention of someone who is not going to say anything till she is certain of what she is saying. When she finished, she looked up. "This is valid. This trust was registered. I don't have the records in front of me, but I know our archive goes back to the 40s, and I know this notation format. This is real." She paused. Irving Bancroft's document, by contrast, she stopped. "Is not," Enid said. "Is not." Opal agreed with the particular directness of a woman who has spent 30 years distinguishing between the two. Opal made calls. Sheriff Alton Caulfield arrived at 8:30. He sat across from Enid at Opal's table and listened to the account with the focused attention of a man who builds a picture while you talk. He looked at the documents. He understood the situation. And then he said something that Enid had not prepared for. "Enid, I believe you, but Irving has a court order signed by Judge Langford. That order is legally binding until it's vacated by the court. I can't override a judge." She looked at him. "Alton, you're telling me that a man used forged papers to steal my home, and you can't do anything?" "I'm telling you that his forged papers were used as the basis for a real court order by a real judge. And until that order is vacated, my hands are tied." He paused. "But I'm also telling you that if you bring these documents to the court and request an emergency hearing, and if the judge reviews them, that order will be vacated." Opal spoke from the counter where she was already pulling files. "The problem is which judge. This county has two. Langford signed Irving's order. Judge Farrow is on medical leave until the end of the week." She let the implications settle. An emergency hearing would go before Langford, the same judge who had signed Irving's order. Enid asked the only question that mattered. "The machines start on my orchard this morning. How much time do we have?" Opal looked at the clock, 9 in the morning. "If I file now, the earliest emergency hearing is 2 o'clock this afternoon. 5 hours. 5 hours to save 60 years. Opal left for the courthouse at 9:30 to file the emergency motion and simultaneously pull the original trust registration from the county archive. This was the strongest piece of evidence Enid had. The trust document in her hands was compelling, but the county's own registration records would prove beyond any argument that the trust was real and had been in place since 1955. Opal called back at 10:15. Her voice had changed. "Enid, the file isn't there, the folder is there, the label is there, but the document inside has been removed." Silence. "The access log for the archive shows that Grady Pennington entered the records room 2 weeks ago. He has access rights like any attorney licensed to practice in the county." Grady had pulled the original registration before he and Irving ever set foot on Enid's driveway. He knew the trust existed. He had removed the evidence. The forged will was not the beginning of this operation. It was the middle. The beginning was Grady Pennington walking into the county archive with his briefcase and walking out with 70 years of Enid's protection in his hands. Without the original county record, Enid would walk into a hearing before a biased judge carrying documents she had pulled from a box buried under a tree for 60 years, and Irving's attorney would argue they were fabricated. The same accusation pointed in both directions, and the judge would decide which way it fell. Sheriff Caulfield, who had been listening on speaker, asked Enid once more if she was sure. She did not hesitate. Alton, my mother, did not bury an ammunition box under a tree for 60 years to hide forgeries. And someone went into the county archive and stole a 70-year-old document 2 weeks before showing up at my door with a fake will. That does not sound like the behavior of a man with legitimate paperwork. The sheriff did not argue, Enid thought. She thought the way she always thought, systematically looking for the link she had not yet seen. And then she remembered Zella Montford, 82 years old, living on the farm 3 miles down the road. Corinne's closest friend from the 1950s onward. If Corinne went to the courthouse in 1955, Zella might know. She asked Sheriff Caulfield to drive her to Zella's house on the way. He agreed because time was moving and because he was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Enid Braddock was not the kind of woman who made things up. Zella Montford opened her door and looked at Enid standing on her porch in Corinne's apron, and the old woman's eyes filled immediately. Not with surprise, with recognition. The kind of recognition that belongs to someone who has been waiting. Your mama told me, Zella said, her voice carrying the particular weight of words that had been held for decades, that if you ever came asking, it meant the time had come. Zella told Enid what she knew. She knew Corinne had a box under the tree. She did not know what was inside because Corinne had not told her and Zella had not asked. But she knew that on March 14th, 1955, she had driven Corinne to the county courthouse, and she had waited in the car while Corinne went inside with Judge Doyle Kinsley, and she had driven Corinne home afterward. Corinne had told Zella only one thing about what she had done that day. I've made sure the land belongs to Enid forever. Zella had kept the secret for more than 70 years because Corinne had asked her to, and because Zella Montford was the kind of woman who kept her word the way other people kept their furniture carefully and for the duration. But Zella had something else. She disappeared into her back room and returned carrying a photograph. Black and white, slightly yellowed, showing two people standing on the steps of the county courthouse. Corinne Thornberry, younger than Enid, had ever seen her in photographs holding a folder of documents. Beside her, an older man in a dark suit, whom Zella identified as Judge Doyle Kinsley. On the back of the photograph, in Corinne's handwriting, March 14th, 1955, complete. And Zella knew one more thing. When Corinne registered the trust, she had asked Judge Kinsley to create a backup copy on microfilm. The county had been running a pilot program for microfilm archiving in the early 50s, and Corinne had specifically requested that her document be included. Zella remembered because Corinne had explained her reasoning on the drive home. Corinne had said, paper can burn, paper can be taken, film is something people don't think about. Enid picked up Zella's telephone from the hallway table and called Opal immediately. Opal went to the courthouse basement, where microfilm reels from the 50s sat in a steel cabinet that nobody had opened in years. 45 minutes later, Opal called back. She had found it. The Thornberry Family Trust microfilm copy, clear and complete. Judge Kinsley's signature. Full terms. And beside the registration, a handwritten note from Kinsley himself stating that the backup copy had been created at the specific request of Mrs. Thornberry, who expressed concern regarding the long-term security of the paper record. Corinne had anticipated the destruction of the paper file in 1955, 70 years before it actually happened. Opal said in a voice Enid had never heard her use, "Enid, your mother was an extraordinary woman." Enid closed her eyes. She stood in Zella Montford's kitchen, holding the telephone receiver, and she thought about her mother at 42 years old, driving to the courthouse with Zella, filing documents that would protect her daughter, requesting a backup that no one else would have thought to request, preparing for a threat that had not yet materialized, and that would not materialize for 7 decades. She opened her eyes. "What time is the hearing?" 2 o'clock, Opal said. I have the microfilm printout, I have the photograph from Zella, and I have the access log showing Grady Pennington entered the archive 2 weeks ago. We have what we need. Sheriff Caulfield, standing by the door, said, "We should go." Enid thanked Zella. The old woman held Enid's hands in both of hers and squeezed and said nothing else because nothing else needed to be said. Then Enid walked to the sheriff's car with the ammunition box under one arm and her mother's letter against her skin. The hearing began at 2 o'clock in the county courtroom. Judge Orville Langford sat at the bench. Enid sat on one side with Opal Ashford representing the county clerk's office. Irving and Grady sat on the other. The room was small and warm and smelled like old wood and legal paper. There were perhaps a dozen people present, mostly courthouse staff, who had heard that something unusual was happening and had found reasons to be in the room. Enid did not look at them. She looked at Langford. She had never been in this courtroom as a party to a dispute. She had been here for jury duty twice for a neighbor's property hearing, once for the ordinary business of county life that occasionally requires the inside of a courthouse. She had always thought of the room as neutral ground, a place where facts were weighed and decisions were made on the basis of evidence. She understood now that this was not always the case. Sometimes the room was a stage and the outcome had been decided before the curtain went up. Langford looked at Enid's documents with an expression she recognized. Not professional skepticism, purposeful skepticism. The skepticism of a man who has already decided what the outcome should be and is looking for reasons to justify it. "Mrs. Braddock," Langford said, "you are presenting documents that you claim to have found in a box buried underground for 60 years. You understand why the court might find this difficult to credit." Grady Pennington added, "Your Honor, county records contain no registration of any trust for Corinne Thornberry. The documents Mrs. Braddock presents cannot be verified." Langford nodded at Grady. The nod was quick, natural, the kind of nod that passes between two people who have an understanding. If you were not watching for it, you would miss it. Enid was watching. Opal Ashford stood. She spoke calmly, and her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of professional authority in a room where she had conducted business thousands of times before, and where her word had the particular gravity of a person known to be careful with facts. She said that the paper file had been removed from the archive. She said that the access log showed Grady Pennington had entered the records room 2 weeks prior. She said she had filed a formal request for investigation into the unauthorized removal of county documents. The room became very quiet. Grady looked at the table in front of him. Opal continued. She said that a microfilm backup of the trust existed and had been located in the courthouse basement that morning. She said the microfilm was created in 1955 and bore the authenticated signature of Judge Doyle Kinsley, who had died in 1978 and whose signature was preserved in county archives for exactly this kind of comparison. She placed the microfilm printout on the bench. She placed Zella Montford's photograph beside it. Corinne Thornberry on the courthouse steps, March 14, 1955. A document folder in her hands, Judge Kinsley beside her. Langford looked at the microfilm printout. Enid watched his face. She saw calculation. The calculation of a man weighing whether he could reject this evidence and what it would cost him. He knew the microfilm was real. It was in his own courthouse system. Nobody could forge 70-year-old microfilm, but he tried. Microfilm of this age may be degraded or inaccurate. The court requires time to verify. Sheriff Caulfield, seated in the back row, stood up. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who has chosen his words carefully before saying them. He said that he wished to note for the record that the archive access log showed the paper file had been removed 2 weeks prior by the attorney representing the claimant, and he wished to note that he was opening an investigation into this matter. And he paused. And then he said that the investigation could expand to include anyone found to have been involved in obstructing justice. The word anyone occupied the room the way a large piece of furniture occupies a small space. It was impossible to ignore, and it changed the configuration of everything around it. Langford understood what it meant. Anyone included a judge who signed a court order based on forged documents without adequate verification, particularly if that judge had a financial relationship with the claimant. Langford vacated the temporary order. He did it with the expression of a man swallowing something bitter, but he did it because the alternative was worse. Enid left the courtroom with the vacated order in her hand. She walked down the courthouse hallway and looked out the window toward the direction of Kettle Creek Road. She could not see the farm from here, but she could see the road that led to it, and she thought about the machines that had been idling at the edge of her orchard since that morning. She did not know if they had started. She did not know if the first tree had already fallen. She turned to Sheriff Caulfield. "Alton, how fast can you drive?" Sheriff Caulfield drove fast. Not recklessly, not with the carelessness of a man showing off, but with the deliberate urgency of someone who understood that minutes mattered and that the distance between the courthouse and Kettle Creek Road was exactly 7 miles, and that 7 miles at speed was a different thing than 7 miles at the pace of the law. Enid sat in the passenger seat with her hands flat on her knees, the vacated court order folded in her shirt pocket beside her mother's letter. 2 documents against her skin. One written by a judge under pressure that afternoon. One written by a mother with 60 years of foresight. She knew which one she trusted more. From the curve half a mile out, she could see the farm, the house, the barn, and beyond them the orchard. She could see the machines, 2 large pieces of equipment parked at the edge of the south field. One had moved closer to the first row of trees than it had been that morning. Men were gathered nearby. Irving's truck was in the drive. But the trees were standing. Every single one of them was standing, and Enid understood why when the sheriff's car came close enough for her to see the things she had not expected. A sedan, old and dust-colored, was parked sideways across the access path to the south field, blocking the route the machines would need to reach the orchard. And on the hood of that sedan, arms crossed over her chest, sat Zella Montford, 82 years old, sitting on the hood of her car in the September heat, positioned between the machinery and the trees with the absolute physical commitment of a woman who had decided she was not going to move and who had arranged her entire body to communicate this decision. One of the machine operators was standing 10 feet from her, hands on his hips, wearing the expression of a man who had been hired to knock down trees and had not been briefed on the possibility of an elderly woman using her vehicle as a barricade. Enid stepped out of the sheriff's car before it had fully stopped. Zella saw her and called across the distance between them, her voice carrying the way voices carry in open country, clear and undiminished by age. "I promised your mama I'd keep her secret until you came asking. I did not promise I'd sit home while they cut down Corinne's trees." Enid looked at Zella Montford on the hood of her car in the middle of the access path, and for the first time in 2 days she felt something that was not grief or anger or determination. She felt the sudden, unexpected, almost painful warmth of being surprised by love from a direction she had not been watching. Sheriff Caulfield pulled up in front of the house. Irving came off the porch when he saw the sheriff's vehicle. He walked toward them with the prepared confidence of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to proceed. He stopped when he saw Enid standing in the yard. She was wearing her mother's apron. Her hands were at her sides. She was not performing anything. She was not dramatic. She was simply present with a particular quality of stillness that comes from absolute certainty, the certainty of a woman who had spent the night in her mother's orchard and the morning in a courtroom, and who had won in both places and who knew it. Irving recovered quickly. He was a man who had done this before, who had been challenged before, who had learned that confidence sustained past the point of reason can sometimes carry the day simply because the other side does not expect it. He addressed the sheriff, directly dismissing Enid with the angle of his body the way a man dismisses something he considers beneath his attention. "Sheriff, I have a valid court order authorizing my use of this property." Caulfield handed him the vacated order. Irving read it. His face did not change immediately. He had excellent control. But his eyes moved to Grady Pennington, and the movement was involuntary, the reflex of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is not where he thought it was and is looking for someone to blame. Grady had read the vacated order over Irving's shoulder and was performing calculations at a speed that Enid could almost see, the rapid assessment of a man determining the fastest route to a lifeboat. Grady had been through situations before. He had survived professional discipline. He had survived the Tatum Pardo case. He had survived by knowing exactly when to abandon a position and by doing it without sentiment. "Irving," Grady said quietly, "I advise you to cooperate with law enforcement." Irving turned on him. "You work for me. I work for the fee you pay me, but I am not going to prison for you." Grady stepped away from Irving. The physical distance was small, perhaps 3 feet, but everyone in the yard understood what it meant. The alliance had fractured, and it had fractured publicly, and there was no way to put it back together. Enid did not watch Irving. She was looking past him, past the house toward the orchard. From where she stood, she could see the central tree, the first one planted, the heart of the arrangement, the tree under which she had spent the night. And she could see, even from this distance, something she had not noticed in the darkness and the early gray of dawn. Along the lower branches, clusters of small, pale blossoms had opened. The apple tree was producing in September what it ordinarily produced in April, a response to some signal that defied the calendar and the season and everything Enid knew about how apple trees worked after 60 years of watching them. She had never seen an apple tree bloom in September. She had never heard of it happening. She looked at it, and she did not try to explain it, because some things do not require explanation. Some things require only witnessing. She began walking toward the orchard. Behind her, she heard Sheriff Caulfield begin the process of placing Irving Bancroft under arrest for fraud and forgery. The charges were read in the flat, professional tone of a man who has done this many times and is doing it correctly. She heard Irving's voice louder, the confidence dissolving into something rawer and less controlled. She heard Grady Pennington speaking rapidly and voluntarily, offering information with the eager cooperation of a man who has decided that his own survival is the only outcome worth pursuing. She heard Grady say that Irving had done this before, at least 3 other counties in Tennessee. The same pattern each time. Elderly women, recently widowed, living alone on inherited land, forged signatures of dead husbands, an attorney to provide the appearance of legitimacy. Locks changed the same day to establish physical possession before the victim could respond. In 2 of the 3 previous cases, Irving had succeeded. The women had lost their land. One of them, a 71-year-old named Ardith, was living in a care home now because she had nowhere else to go after her family farm was taken. Grady spoke with the fluency of a man who has been keeping accounts in his head and has decided to present the full ledger. He described how Irving found his targets checking obituary notices in county newspapers across the state, looking for men who had died leaving wives on rural property, particularly property without mortgages, property that was owned free and clear, the kind of property that could be sold quickly once the transfer was complete. He described how Irving would visit the area, first posing as a potential buyer or a distant relative reconnecting with family, gathering information about the property, the family situation, and most importantly, whether the widow had the resources or the connections to fight back. The ones who seemed most alone, most vulnerable, most likely to accept the loss rather than contest it in court, those were the ones Irving chose. Enid heard this and she kept walking. She walked through the orchard gate and through the rows of iron trees, past the ones that were still struggling, and the ones that had not made it, and the ones that had surprised her by holding on, and she walked until she reached the central tree. The blossoms were real. She touched one and felt the petals cool and soft in the September air. Real flowers on a tree that had been declining for years on a morning in September that was entirely the wrong time for this to happen. She put her hand on the trunk and felt it solid and enduring beneath her palm. She thought about her mother. She thought about the letter and what it meant to spend a life building things that outlast you. The orchard, the coins, the document in the box, the key in the hem, the trust in the county records patient and unchanged for 60 years waiting for the morning it was needed. And the microfilm, the backup that nobody else would have thought to request, created by a woman who understood that protection is not a single wall, but a series of walls, each one standing behind the last, so that when one falls, there is another. "I found it, Mama," she said quietly. "I found everything you left me." The September morning was very still. The blossoms moved in a wind she could barely feel. She heard footsteps behind her. Not the sheriff, not Irving. She turned. Sable was standing at the orchard gate. Her daughter had not driven from Nashville. Enid learned later that Sable had been in the county all day, parked on the county road half a mile from the farm, since early morning, unable to drive in and unable to drive away. She had watched the sheriff's car arrive. She had watched the machine shut down. She had watched Irving being put into the back of a patrol car. She had sat in her sedan for another 20 minutes after that, and then she had gotten out and walked up the drive and through the gate and into the orchard where her grandmother had read to her mother and where her mother had slept last night on the ground with an ammunition box between the roots of a tree. Sable stood at the gate and she did not come closer because she did not know if she was welcome. Her face carried the particular expression of a person who has realized too late what they have done and who does not yet know if the damage can be repaired. She had been crying. Her makeup was ruined in the way that suggests extended and uncontrolled weeping, the kind that happens in a parked car on a county road while you watch your mother's life being fought over and understand that you chose the wrong side. Enid looked at her daughter across the rows of iron trees. She did not speak. She waited. Because this was Sable's walk to make, and Enid could not make it for her. Sable took a step, then another. She walked through the orchard, slowly past the trees she had played under as a child, past the rows she had helped harvest as a teenager, before she decided the farm was too small for her ambitions, and Nashville was where real life happened. She walked until she was standing in front of Enid, close enough to touch, and she said the only thing there was to say. "I'm sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry." Enid studied her daughter's face. She looked for the things a mother looks for, the markers of sincerity that you learn to read over the course of 44 years of watching someone grow from infant to child to woman. She saw grief, she saw shame, she saw something that had cracked open and that would take time to heal, but that was, she believed, genuinely cracked and not performed. She said, "You don't need to be sorry anymore. You need to sit down." There was nowhere to sit except the ground, so they sat. Mother and daughter at the base of the tree. Corinne had planted their backs against the trunk in the position Enid had occupied alone through the night, but that now held two people, which changed the geometry of it entirely. Sable spoke first. "Irving called me 3 weeks ago. He told me Daddy had been worried about you. He told me Daddy had signed papers because He wanted the farm to be managed properly. He offered me 15% of the land value if I helped convince you to cooperate. She paused. I didn't take the money, but I didn't say no either, and I didn't warn you, because part of me thought he might be right. Not about the papers, about you being alone out here. I thought if you had to leave the farm, maybe it would be better for you. Maybe you'd finally come to Nashville and I could take care of you. She looked at Enid. I told myself I was doing it for you. I know now that I was doing it for me, because I was scared of losing you out here. And I thought if I could get you closer, it would hurt less when it happened. She stopped. She picked up a handful of soil from the base of the tree and let it fall through her fingers, watching it go, the way people watch things fall when they are thinking about loss. When I was little, Sable said Grandma Corinne used to bring me out here and tell me the names of every tree. She had names for all of them, not the variety names, her names. The one by the fence was Old Soldier because it leaned like a man standing at attention. The twin trunks by the creek were the sisters, and this one. She looked up at the central tree above them. She called this one the Promise. I asked her once what it was promising, and she said everything I couldn't say out loud. Enid had not known this. In 74 years of living on this farm and 60 years of tending this orchard, she had not known that her mother had given names to the trees. She had not known that Corinne had shared those names with her granddaughter during visits that Enid had thought were just an old woman keeping a child busy while the adults worked. I forgot all of that, Sable said. I moved to Nashville and I forgot what this place was. I turned it into a number on a listing sheet, square footage, acreage, comparable sales. I turned my own inheritance into a real estate transaction, and I almost let a stranger take it because I was too busy being practical to remember what it meant. Enid absorbed this. She sat with it the way she sat with all difficult information, turning it over, examining it from each side, looking for the thing it was really about underneath the thing it appeared to be about. And what she found underneath was not malice. It was fear. Her daughter was afraid of losing her mother, and the fear had made Sable do a terrible thing for a reason that was at its root love. Twisted and misguided and damaging, but love. Your grandmother, Enid said after a while, spent her whole life alone on this farm, and she built something that saved me 60 years after she put it in the ground. Being alone doesn't mean being unprotected. It means you have to build more carefully. She told Sable about the box, about the letters the soldiers, the families Corinne had fed through winters no one else knew about the coins and the trust and the key sewn into the apron. She told her about Vernell's letter from 1958, about a woman who had faced the same kind of predator and had been helped by Corinne to keep her land. She told her about Zella Montfort driving Corinne to the courthouse in 1955 and keeping the secret for 70 years. She told her about the microfilm. When Enid finished, the September light had shifted into the lower angle of late afternoon, and the orchard was doing what the orchard did at this hour, which was to become a place of long shadows and warm trunks and the particular silence that lives between trees that have been standing together for a long time. Sable was quiet, then she said, Grandma knew this would happen. Not this specifically, but she knew it could, and she prepared. Sable looked at the tree above them, at the impossible September blossoms on the lower branches. Mama, I want the farm. I just forgot that I wanted it. Enid returned to the farmhouse on Thursday with the original keys recovered from Irving's possession and a locksmith who restored the lock she preferred. She walked through the rooms with the attention of someone returning to a familiar place after an interval that has changed them. The kitchen, where the morning light fell across the counter in the same pattern it had followed for as long as she could remember. The back bedroom where her mother had died and where she herself had been born, the window still catching the early sun. The room off the kitchen where the filing cabinet lived, the room that smelled like old paper and the particular dust of decades. Everything was where she had left it, and nothing was the same. The men who had inventoried her home had moved things. Small displacements, a frame shifted 2 inches to the left, a drawer not fully closed, the Afghan on the sofa folded differently than she folded it. Each small change was a fingerprint of violation evidence that strangers had touched her life and found it insufficiently interesting to handle with care. She moved through the house and put each thing back where it belonged, precisely deliberately, the way you rebuild something that has been shaken but not broken. She put the documents in the filing cabinet. She put the ammunition box on the shelf in the same room, the coins still inside in their bundles, the letters still tied with kitchen string. She would deal with them properly, but not today. Today she made tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden. Sable sat across from her, 2 cups of tea. The kitchen where Sable had grown up, where Corinne had cooked, where the apron had hung on its hook beside the stove for decades until Irving handed it to Enid as if it were nothing. The silence between them was the kind that exists between people who are learning to trust each other again. A silence that is not empty, but full of the careful effort of rebuilding. The legal resolution was thorough. Opal Ashford called Enid a week later with the full account, and thorough was the word she used because Opal used words carefully, and thorough was precisely right. Not quick, not simple, but thorough in the way of things done properly. Irving's forged documents had been produced with the assistance of Grady Pennington, whose law license was now under review by the State Bar Association. The forgery charges were clear, and the fraud charges were clear, and the pattern of similar activity in other counties made the situation clearer still. Grady, cooperating fully in exchange for consideration, confirmed what Enid had suspected in the courtroom. Judge Orville Langford owed Irving money from a failed land deal 3 years prior. Langford had signed the temporary order not because he believed the documents were legitimate, but because approving Irving's claim would cancel the debt. Langford was not charged directly, but he resigned from the bench within 3 months, citing personal reasons, which was the kind of resignation that everyone in the county understood without needing it explained. The 2 women Irving had defrauded in other counties came forward after the story appeared in the local paper. One was 71, the other was 68. Both had lost family farms to the same scheme, the same pattern, the same deliberate targeting of women who were alone and grieving and presumed to be easy. The legal process to restore their land began. It would be slow and complicated, but it began, and it began because of a box buried under an apple tree by a woman who had been dead for 11 years. Enid thought about those 2 women often in the weeks that followed. She thought about what separated her outcome from theirs. Not intelligence, not courage, not will. Corinne, the difference was Corinne, a mother who had anticipated the threat and built protections that lasted beyond her own life. The other women had not had a Corinne, and Enid carried the weight of that knowledge quietly, the understanding that her survival was not entirely her own achievement, but the result of someone else's love expressed as foresight. 2 weeks after their arrest, Larkin Hendren appeared at Enid's door. He stood on the porch holding a basket of food and wearing the expression of a man who has not slept well for many nights. He did not apologize at length because he was not that kind of man. He said 5 words. "I was wrong, I'm sorry." Enid looked at Larkin. She thought about the morning at his kitchen table, the coffee he had given her, and the phone he had refused, the fear in his voice and the shame between them. She thought about Tatum Pardo and the bankruptcy and the reason Larkin had been afraid. And she thought about the difference between understanding why someone failed you and forgiving them for it, and she decided that 40 years of friendship was worth more than one morning of cowardice, and that her mother, who had spent a lifetime giving second chances to people she barely knew, would have considered this obvious. "I know," she said. "Sit down, the tea's still hot." Larkin sat. He drank the tea. He asked about the orchard. Enid told him she was going to restore it. Larkin looked out the kitchen window toward the south field, where the trees stood in their September state bare and struggling and alive, and he said, "If you need someone to carry the heavy things, I figure I owe you at least that much." Enid looked at him, and for the first time since the Wednesday morning when Irving's truck came down her driveway, she smiled, a real smile, the kind that uses the whole face. "I'll call you," she said. The following spring, Enid brought in an orchardist from the next county who had known her mother slightly and who assessed the trees with the focused attention of someone who sees what others have given up on. He said that the iron trees were not dead, that the root systems were largely intact, that the decline had been disease-related and specific, and that with proper treatment in time, a significant portion of the orchard was recoverable. He used the word recoverable with emphasis because he knew it mattered. Enid began the treatment. She learned what she needed to learn. She gave the orchard the same attention her mother had given it, consistent and patient season by season. Sable came home every weekend. At first, she only watched. Then she began to ask questions. Then she began to help. By autumn of the first year, Sable could distinguish a diseased branch from a healthy one, could prune without damaging new growth, could name the rows of trees in the order Corinne had planted them, because Enid had told her and Sable had listened. Truly listen the way you listen when you have almost lost something and have been given a second chance to pay attention. One Saturday in October, Sable arrived with a box of her own. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it and took out a leather-bound journal, with Sable Braddock written on the inside cover, and she began to write. She wrote the names Corinne had given the trees, the ones she remembered from childhood and the ones Enid could supply. She wrote the planting dates and the treatment history and which trees had responded to what. She wrote the way Enid documented things carefully and completely so that the knowledge would not be lost when it was needed. Enid watched her daughter writing in the journal at the kitchen table, and she thought about Corinne writing letters to soldiers at this same table 60 years ago, and she thought about the particular persistence of women who write things down. Larkin Hendren came once a month with his truck and helped move the heavy things, mulch and soil amendments, and the supplies that a restoration project requires. He and Enid did not talk about the morning he had refused her. They did not need to. The work was the conversation, and the conversation was sufficient. Zella Montford came to the orchard on Sundays. She brought a folding chair and sat among the trees and told stories about Corinne that Enid had never heard. Stories from the 50s and 60s when Corinne and Zella were young women running farms and raising children and doing the quiet work that held their community together. Enid listened to these stories the way you listen to music you did not know you needed, the way you listen to something that fills a space you did not realize was empty. By the second spring, more than half the surviving trees had produced new growth. Cautious at first, the way living things return to themselves after a long difficulty, then with increasing confidence as the season progressed. Enid documented everything carefully so she would know what had worked and could do more of it. By the third spring, the orchard was in full bloom for the first time in years. Enid stood in the orchard on a May morning in the third year with the apple trees in full flower around her. Every tree that had survived, every tree that had been given the right treatment in the right time, and the patient attention of someone who believed in it even when it looked finished. The air carried the sweetness of apple blossoms that she had known since childhood, that she had breathed every spring of her life on this farm, that she had been afraid during the hard months when the orchard seemed past saving, she would never smell again in this place. The central tree was in full bloom, the first tree, the heart of the orchard, the iron tree that Corinne had put in the ground when Enid was 14 years old. Its branches were covered in white and pale pink blossoms, more blossoms than Enid had seen on this tree in a decade. The trunk carried the warmth of the May morning, the particular warmth of something that has survived what it was not supposed to survive, and is now quietly, emphatically continuing. She was wearing the apron. The hem had been re-sewn after she had opened it to find the key. The new stitching was different from Corinne's rougher and more visible, the mark of something that had been opened and closed again. A scar of sorts, but a scar on something that was still whole. Sable stood beside her. Her daughter's hand rested on the bark of the central tree, fingers spread against the surface. Enid watched her daughter touch the tree that Corinne had planted in the same gesture that Enid herself used, in the same gesture that Corinne had used before either of them. 3 generations of women, the same tree, the same motion of palm against bark. A gesture passed down not through instruction but through inheritance, the way certain things pass from mother to daughter without ever being spoken aloud. On the far side of the orchard, Zella Montfort sat in the folding chair that Larkin Hendren brought for her every Sunday. She watched Enid and Sable beneath the blossoming tree with the particular expression of a woman who has kept a promise for 70 years and has lived long enough to see what the promise protected. Enid thought about roots, the ones you can see rising from the soil to show you how deeply a tree has anchored itself, and the ones you cannot see, the ones that go down into the dark earth further than any shovel reaches, holding through drought and disease and hard seasons with the patience of things that have learned to endure. The iron trees had survived because their roots went deep enough. Corinne had survived because hers did too, and Enid herself had survived the night in the orchard and the morning at the courthouse and all the mornings since because of the same reason. Depth, the depth of what her mother had built and the depth of what her mother had believed and the depth of love expressed not as a single grand gesture, but as a lifetime of small, deliberate, invisible acts of preparation and care. She thought about Corinne sewing a key into a hem. She thought about 60 years of letters in a box and coins wrapped in oilskin and a document in a county registry that had waited patiently for the morning it was needed. She thought about a woman requesting a microfilm backup in 1955 because paper can burn and paper can be taken, and film is something people don't think about. She thought about the patience of that, the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who had prepared something for her daughter and trusted that her daughter would find it. She thought about the 2 women in other counties whose land was being restored slowly and with difficulty because Corinne's box had not only saved Enid's farm, but had exposed the man who had taken theirs. Corinne had protected women she never met 70 years after burying the evidence that would undo the man who preyed on them. She said loud enough for Sable to hear, "I intend to do the same." Sable looked at her. "What do you mean?" Enid looked at the orchard in bloom around them, the iron trees doing what Corinne had always believed they would do if given the right conditions and enough time. She looked at the apron she was wearing, the fabric that had carried a secret for decades, and that now carried the memory of having been opened and the evidence of having been repaired. She looked at her daughter's hand on the trunk of the tree. "Build things that last," Enid said. The orchard bloomed around them in that May morning, white and pink against the green of new leaves, the air thick with sweetness. The bees already working their way from blossom to blossom in the focused, industrious way of creatures who do not know anything about human grief or human fraud or human redemption, but who know everything about what a flowering tree offers to those patient enough to wait for it. Zella Montford smiled from her folding chair. Larkin Hendren's truck turned into the driveway with a load of mulch for the summer. Somewhere in Nashville, in a real estate office, was short one agent on weekends now because Sable Braddock had started driving to Kettle Creek Road every Friday evening and not returning until Monday morning, and her colleagues had stopped asking why. The coins remained in the ammunition box on the shelf in the room off the kitchen. Enid had taken them to Thurman Overhill in Cookville, a careful and precise man who spent 2 hours with the contents before speaking. He said that several coins held significant numismatic value and that the collection would be of great interest to serious collectors. He gave a preliminary estimate that was substantial enough to change a person's life if the person were inclined to sell. Enid was not inclined. The coins were not currency, they were evidence. Each one a thank you, each one proof that kindness given leaves a mark that lasts longer than the giver. She kept the letters two-tied with kitchen string on the shelf, where Corinne's apron hung on its hook in the house where all of it had happened and where all of it would be remembered. And on the shelf beside the ammunition box, Enid placed one more thing. A new envelope, unsealed, written in her own handwriting, dressed to Sable Jane Thornberry Braddock. Inside was a single sheet of paper on which Enid had written in the careful hand she had learned from her mother instructions for where to find the trust documents and the coins and the letters if Enid were no longer here to show her. She had written the location of the filing cabinet and the combination to the lock and the name of Opal Ashford at the county clerk's office and the name of Thurman Overhill in Cookville and the name of Zella Montford 3 miles down the road. She had written everything her daughter would need. She did not sew it into the hem of the apron. She put it on the shelf in plain sight because some secrets are meant to be hidden and some are meant to be found easily, and the difference between the two is whether you trust the person you are leaving them for. Corinne had trusted Enid with a buried box and a hidden key because the circumstances required it. Enid trusted Sable with an open shelf because the circumstances had changed, and because trust once broken and rebuilt sometimes comes back stronger than it was before, the way a bone heals thicker at the break. If this story touched you, hit that like button so this story of a mother's lasting love can reach more people who need it today. And I want to ask you something before you go. Think about Corinne, the key sewn into the hem, the box under the roots, the 70 years of quiet faith that her daughter would find what she needed when the time came. If you had to describe that kind of love in just one single word, what would your word be? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. A warm embrace to each and every one of you. I will see you in the next story.